Welcome to another episode of How It Works with Holger. In the following video series, I'm going to talk about data grids with Tabular in TMS Web Core. I don't know how many parts it's going to be, but let's start with part 1. And as the great reveal, I'm going to show you what we will be able to build in the end. The JavaScript library we're going to use is called Tabular, and we will display data from an external web service. We are going to use the iTunes web service from Apple, which is very easy to use because you do not need any authentication data. So you can use it right out of the box, which gives you the ability to reproduce this right away. And I click Show Data. The data is being retrieved, and here I get a list of all the Star Wars movies in the iTunes database. And the grid supports filtering. For example, I can filter Jedi, then I only see the 2 movies that have the name Jedi in it, or I can remove that filter. I can filter by genre. For example, here, autocomplete documentary, take that away. That is all features of the grid, nothing I have to do. I can sort by release date or inverse release date. This is all included inside of the Tabular framework, which you can use with TMS Web Core very, very easily. And the best thing is, you don't need to learn JavaScript to do this. This is mostly Pascal, Object Pascal that you will be using. However, before we start with this complex of an example, let's start with a very simple example. On the form of this magnificent major example that we start off with is just one single button. It's a T-Web button, and that is actually the button that we will click in order to show the data in the grid. Let me show the application that we'll build, and we go step by step through all the steps that are needed to build this. So again, basic example, I click Show Data, and I get a grid with my name, Bruno's names, our realistic age. Who guesses which dates these are gets a cookie. And we have as job, evangelist, and innovator. And with clicks, I can sort by age, by name. What I can also do is I can click again and I can edit these. So I can, for example, also edit the birthday here, and the control automatically selects the correct editor for these. So there's a date editor, there's a progress bar editor, there's a ratings editor. But for this example, we have numbers and strings and dates, but there is no working wolf. This is all automatic. So how do we get started? First, the tabulator.info webpage is your friend. You see examples after example. So that will help you after doing this very simple example in TMS Web Core to build on it, to build a more complex example. And the first step before you can start with it, you need to be able to include it into your TMS Web Core projects, because TMS Web Core by default does not have an entry in the JavaScript library manager. So what you need to do, you need to learn how to insert this into your project. And you will find that in the documentation. And there's a part called installation. And we always want to use the CDN, the Content Delivery Network feature. And here we find to use the latest version, we just have to copy this. And these 2 lines here include the JavaScript library into your project. Where do you do that? In TMS Web Core. You can either do it in your form, HTML, but that would mean this JavaScript library is only being loaded for that particular form. That doesn't make any sense. We want it for the whole project because we might want to use the grid at multiple places. So we go to the index.html file or the project HTML file, depending on how you name it when you create your project. In this case, I picked the name index.html. And by default, this is the template that TMS Web Core generates for us. But I added 2 more lines right here to insert or to load the tabulator framework when our application launches. Also, I did not just create a TMS Web Core application, I created a TMS Web Core Bootstrap application. That means I also have the Bootstrap included, but that has been done by TMS Web Core. And what TMS Web Core then also does is if you click on the form canvas, you get the CSS library set to CSS Bootstrap. That means as soon as we drop a button on the form, for example, right here, it gets its font and its layout from the Bootstrap framework. However, in this case, I go even one step farther. And as you know, if you have looked some of the introductory TMS Web Core videos, you have multiple options to design your forms in TMS Web Core. You can either just drop the controls on the form, you can drop the controls and then add certain CSS styling to these components, or what I did here, you use these, or you use the form designer as your place to store the TMS Web Core components so that you can access them in code. So right here, if you look at the object inspector, the component is named button show. It's a web button. That is how I can access it in code. So looking at the source code, for example, on the create event for the form, I set the visibility of the button to true to be certain that it is being shown. And if I switch back to the form designer, you also see that this button doesn't have a caption and the position doesn't seem to be really that important, because if we look at the example again, it appears on the right side and is rather small, and also this tabular basic example is not shown on the form. So where does it come from? Well, that comes from the HTML template inside of our form. So our main form has an HTML document attached, and there you find the definition what our form looks like. So instead of using the design from the form designer, I designed my own form using HTML with TMS Web Core. If you use the Visual Studio Code IDE, you get what you see is what you get for this particular case, but it doesn't really matter. I only need the button and the interaction. So I define in my HTML the button right here inside of a bootstrap grid. What do I do in this template? Just as an explanation in case you're still new to Bootstrap. I define a container with padding on all sides of 5, and then with the display 1 class, which is the biggest one, I write tabulator basic example. I start with a row, and the row has 2 columns. One is 10 units wide and the other one 2, which makes 12, and each bootstrap row consists of exactly 12, so that makes perfect sense. So we have 10 on the left and 2 on the right. And what is being displayed inside of these columns? Well, the column that has the size 2 shows the button with show data, and this button has the ID button show. And that is linked to the control on my form right here. If we look at the element ID, that's how it's linked. It has nothing to do with the name of the control inside of our Delphi code. However, as I don't want to get confused, I use the same name to make it easier for me to remember. But that's just a personal preference. Going from here, the button is defined. What is in the other column? In the other column, I have a placeholder, nothing more. There is a div tag, and the contents of that div is empty. That means there is nothing being displayed. And if we start the application, we can actually see that. If we run the application, we just see the empty template, so to speak. So here, that's just the heading. This space is empty, and the second column has the data. If you go into the developer console pressing F12, you can also make this visible. For example, clicking here, you see all the different elements of your page. And here we see the div of column size 10 with the blue rectangle. And moving over to the right, I see the button in the column of size 2. Of course, this also works for the container that everything is contained in. Here, the container spans all the content of the page so far. So this is a very helpful tool analyzing the structure of your web layout. So now to the interesting part, to create the grid. And that's really, really easy with the tabular framework. So going back to the source code, we define by double clicking on the button what is supposed to happen if we double click on the button. And the data structure that we want to display in the grid, we can use a simple record. TMS Web Core is going to do all the work for us to convert it into a data type that is understood by JavaScript and that can be handled by the JavaScript control. That is the key point to remember. You have full compile time type safety when you compile this project. Unlike when you use JavaScript directly and use ASM statements and write everything in JavaScript constructs. This approach that I present here gives you type safety at compile time. So tPerson is the record that we're going to use, and each person is going to have a name, age, a job, and a birthday. And birthday string, you might be like, Holger, why did you use string and not tdate time? Well, that is something I already do to prepare for the grid. I'm going to use an isodate string, which is common on the web. So instead of using the double value that Delphi uses, I immediately use the ISO value. And in order to generate that, I'm going to use the business library from TMS that has a conversion mechanism that I can use to convert a tdate time or a tdate to an ISO string that represents that date automatically without implementing it myself. So with that being said, I have an array of those tPerson records, 2 to be precise. So I set the length of the array to 2 and I add 2 people. And first, my name, my age, and we already see different data types, string, integer. And let's assume I do something that wouldn't trigger any error when I used JavaScript. Let's say I make the 27 a string and I recompile. At that point, I already get a compile time error because the data types don't match. If I were to use JavaScript specific types, there wouldn't be an error because JavaScript isn't that picky when it comes to its objects. It basically would say, okay, age is a string. That's it. Because there is no definition for the data structure. And then we have job and the birthday using the tBCLUtils class. And that has a class method class function that converts the date time to ISO. So I call the encode date function from the RTL, Delphi RTL, which is also available in TMS Web Core to create a date time value easily. And the false actually is just a parameter to influence the date time to ISO encoding for a special case that we don't need in this case. So this will create a tdate in ISO format. And going ahead right here, we have the second person. And as it's an array, we don't need to, an array of record, we don't need to instantiate anything. We can just access the first and the second element of the array like that. And now to the magic with the tabular framework. The only thing I do is, and here I have no other means but to use ASM because I have to write JavaScript. That's the one line I need to write in JavaScript. I can't get around that. So I simply say show table with LData, and LData is my array of tPerson. That's the only thing I need. And then I basically set the visibility of the button to false in order to hide the button because I clicked it. I want to show the grid and I don't want to give the user the ability to click on the button again and again. So I simply hide it. That's it. So the final piece of the puzzle is what is inside of the show table. Is it a function? Is it a procedure? What is it? Well, it is JavaScript because as soon as you write ASM, kind of like you write in Delphi. If you write ASM, it means assembler. Because in Delphi, if you use the ASM, it's assembler, and the assembler of TMS Web Core, that's how I remember these things, is JavaScript. So in this case, this line of code is JavaScript. And showTable LData calls the function showTable with the parameter LData. But where is that function? It is part of the template right here. And it's included in the script tags of your HTML. And now you might be saying, well, Holger, you said we don't need JavaScript in order to code with TMS Web Core, and well, not needing it to, or not conceiving JavaScript is quite different from copy pasting JavaScript from a documentation for me. That is the only thing you need to do. You go to the documentation of the tabulator framework, and then you look at the quick start example, how everything works. And there you see that you need to define an element, which we did. I think it's even called example table. I didn't even deviate from that. I literally copied the, sorry, not the index HTML. I need to go into the HTML file of the form. And here we go. I literally copy pasted from the documentation example table. This is where the table is supposed to appear, or the grid is supposed to appear. And then you need a column definition for the table. And this is my column definition plus data. So we have our data definition. Our data definition is our array of tPerson. And TMS Web Core is so smart, as it is a web framework, to convert it into a structure like this. We don't have to care about any of that. The only thing we need to do, we need to call this. This is the call we need to copy paste. And if you look at this, we create a new tabulator. That is the name of the component. That is the grid that we want to show. And then the first parameter here is where. And hashtag example table refers to this element that we defined in our HTML. So this will display the example table exactly at the position of the div tag with the name example table. And then you can add a height, or you can just specify basically you can specify all the parameters for the grid, how it's supposed to be rendered. And in this case, I just specify data, and I need the columns. And the columns have a very easy definition. You can basically say, define a title, a field, a width, or if you don't specify a width, it's auto. And how do you know what you can put here into these definitions? Well, you find that in the column setup, in the documentation. There you find all the different means to influence the appearance of your column. The only tiny little JavaScript thing you need to remember is if you specify a parameter with multiple options, it's always in JSON, like you see it here, like you have an opening squiggly brackets and then closing squiggly brackets. That's basically how I specify parameters that have multiple values. You can think of it as an object that you pass in. So this object has the property height, data, layout, and columns itself is yet another array. That's why we have the square brackets consisting of multiple column definitions. And what I did is I copy pasted this into my template right here. So I have the function show table, that is the function definition, and I simply pass in some data. That's the name of the parameter, tab data. And as I said, JavaScript doesn't have a strong type system, so there is no type definition after this. I simply say I have a function, it's called show table, and the parameter is called tab data, and then I have opening brace and closing brace for what is supposed to happen inside of that function. And that is one-to-one a copy from the documentation, where I say I have a table new tabulator, example table. That means it will appear right up here. And the data is tab data. That is where TMS Web Core comes in. Instead of specifying something hard-coded in my JavaScript, I have my tab data that I call from my code. So the type, the local variable that I define inside of my Delphi code can be passed into this JavaScript snippet. It's not code, it's just a snippet that I copy pasted from the documentation. There's nothing to it, believe me. If you fiddle around with it a little bit, you'll figure it out very, very quickly. And it is amazing how quickly you get great results that you want inside of the web. So the column definition right here is simply that I say I have a name, age, job, birthday. Those are the titles. And then I have the fields. What are the field names? Well, the field names have to match the properties. So name, age, job. If we look at the data type right here, those are name, age, job, and birthday. They have to be correctly capitalized too, because JavaScript is not case insensitive, it is case sensitive, unlike Delphi. So we have these fields. And in addition, I also specify that I want to be able to edit this by specifying editor input, which is a normal text input, editor number, which is a number input, input again, and then here editor date, same thing. Enabling an editor that allows me to edit dates. And when it comes to sorting, I also help the framework a little bit. This is a string, this is a number, string, and date. Done. And each of the columns is wrapped with quickly brackets, of course, because it's one object, so to speak, a comma, and the next column, comma, next column. And that's how you define the 4 columns. And what now happens is that inside of tab data, the tabular framework is going to look for name, age, job, and birthday to display in all the columns. And that's it. This one line basically displays the table. If this code is being executed, so to speak, the tabulator framework generates at this position right here the table that allows us to do all these things. Granted, right now we just display the table, but if you enable certain other features by specifying these features here inside of your configuration of the tabulator control, you can define stuff like paging, you can enable filters, and so on, which we'll do next time. Also, what you can also do, instead of passing here the columns or the column array just as a hard-coded JSON inside of your script, you could also do this, comma, columns, and then create an array of your T-column definition, which could also be a record or a class, and then simply pass columns in here instead of specifying it manually here. That way, again, TMS Web Core would do the work for you and generate the JSON for you. The advantage is you would once again have type safety at compile time, which here, of course, you don't have. Like if you mistype name or age, you would get an error at runtime, not at compile time, because the TMS Web Core compiler is not able to check if your scripts are correct, because these scripts are JavaScript, and JavaScript, sadly, is a language where you notice errors at runtime and not at compile time, because there is no compiler. So with that, let's look at this example again. I click show data. I don't have anything I output to the console or anything. I just click show data. And I also can resize the column. I forgot to mention that. But these are all things you can influence by modifying the configuration of the grid. And that's what we're going to do in the next parts. You will learn how to retrieve data from a web service and how you can display it quickly in one of these grids without even creating any classes or records in TMS Web Core, because the tabular framework is able to handle web service results directly, easily, and TMS Web Core will help you to pass the correct part of a web service result into the grid. And that will help you to build web clients for your web services much more efficiently, because you can present information quickly, and you can also allow users to filter, sort, enable paging, and of course, if you want to, that is a little bit more sophisticated. You can implement the events if changes are being made, that these changes are being sent back to the web service and stored in your database, for example. That is all possible with TMS Web Core using this great JavaScript library. I hope you enjoyed this incursion into using a JavaScript library from TMS Web Core with a very practical, simple example. And even more so, I really hope it takes away the fear of touching another language like JavaScript, because the only way you have to touch it in this regard is you copy paste it from the documentation and make tiny little changes, but the core of your application relies in Delphi. It relies with type safety, because TMS Web Core provides you with the compiler that gives you this assurance that your software is type safe, and when you execute it, there will be few surprises at runtime. Thank you so much for watching How It Works with Holger. Take care and see you soon.